Howdy, welcome to the channel. Today I will be ranking FF14's Alliance raids. For this tier list, I'm going to be only judging the raid overall, so only the bosses and the raid experience including the levels. I will not be judging the raid by its items or any materials that come from the raids itself. That is the criteria that we're going to base this on. Without further ado, I'm not going to take too much time on the intro. We're going to jump straight into the tier list. So, coming in at absolute D tier is World of Darkness. Now, with the level 50 raids, you know for a fact that most of your classes are going to be quite nerfed. For most classes, you literally just press 3 buttons, and maybe a few cooldowns here and there, but overall, you're mainly going to just be pressing 3 buttons. Now take that, and imagine if the boss, the main boss, literally does nothing, and there's no penalty for you standing still and just attacking them repeatedly. That mainly goes to the Eye boss, the 5-headed dragon, and Cloud of Darkness. Most of these bosses you could just stand in one little corner that evades most AoEs and you'll just be fine. Syrcus makes it so that each alliance has to do a specific job, but it usually takes 1 or 2 people to really accomplish it, except the belly mechanic, which that usually takes the whole team or this whole alliance to complete that. But overall, World of Darkness is just extremely boring. And especially at a low level, it's just not very fun. Especially how often you might get this, since it's level 50. You're gonna wish that most of these bosses could go down a lot faster than they do, because they have a large amount of health. Coming right after World of Darkness is done, Syrcus. For this alliance raid, the very first boss is actually really hard compared to the rest of the bosses on, the early list. He has an arena to where you could fall off, and some of his mechanics require you to be pushed and to go in a safe area to not instantly die. And especially with how many dooms and mechanics there are, a lot of people tend to die quite a bit on this mechanic, which leads to a lot of people just leaving altogether. The Jester is another boss that you can mainly ignore the mechanics and just keep attacking. He does have a few instant kill mechanics like the fire and water, but most of those can just be taken care of by a few people. Scaith, or the Queen, isn't really that tough on the surface. She does have a bit of AoEs that makes it so you have to dodge a couple attacks, but it's nothing that you can't handle or dodge. But the main thing that drives home that this isn't a really good raid is the final boss of this raid. There are 2 phases with the final bosses. One is just Diablos, and then one is Nightmare Diablos. Oh my god. The beginning of the second phase, he is immune to everything. If he started in his hollow Diablos, this would have been a much better raid, or a faster paced raid, but as it stands, this is kind of a not great raid. The very first boss is pretty difficult and could lead to a lot of people leaving, and then the final boss just goes on for too long, so D tier it is. Coming up to C tier, we get to this Weeping City of March. Now the Weeping City of March, I would have placed higher on this list if we just did soundtracks alone, because this shit's got a good ass soundtrack. FF9. Although the soundtrack is very good, most of the bosses here are lackluster and don't really have that much to them. I kind of forgot most of them, even looking at the list and seeing the bosses. You don't really remember them, and they're not really too formidable, except one boss. Forgout is the one exception to where this raid can take it so that it's a breeze to fucking hard. If you do not know the mechanic for Megadeth, then as the name, you're gonna die. This alliance raid is very basic, nothing spectacular. It's just a normal alliance raid that you wouldn't really mind getting. Void Ark and also Weeping City of March, since they're both level 60, you have a bit more tools to your disposal. Void Ark is a bit more memorable. Most of the bosses here are pretty unique. The first boss being a giant whale, and then you have to save an alliance from being drowned, is pretty cool. Sawtooth and that little giant plant in the middle. The rest of the bosses are pretty okay, but overall, Void Ark, it's not a raid that you wouldn't really hate to get necessarily, but, pretty good starter for the Heavensward raids. Next up, we have Labyrinth the Ancients. This is a level 50 raid, and the very first one, actually. And this raid is very fast, and there's not a lot of mechanics to it that you necessarily do. You can also just stand there and click your 3 buttons. Not very engaging, but it's a lot more quicker than something like World of Darkness, where you just sit there and stand forever. A lot of the bosses here die with an instant. Most of them are just mini bosses. Bone Dragon, Thanatos, all the ones. King Behemoth is a pretty cool one in terms of his mechanic, where you have to hide behind a massive meteor. And then the final boss with his Ancient Flare does require a bit of coordination with the other alliances, otherwise you have to restart the fight all over again. But unlike the first boss in Dun, this is at the very end, so you're not going to have that many people leave the alliance just because you wiped. Rounding up C tier, we have Ridorana the Lighthouse. Ridorana's Lighthouse is overall, I'd say, the weakest in terms of the Stormblood raids. It has a few notable bosses, some pretty good ones, especially Construct 7, a very, very unique boss that I actually quite enjoy pulling out a cheat sheet for. The bosses prior to Construct are not that unique, but they're pretty good, and especially being at level 70, you have more mechanics with your jobs, and it's more engaging compared to the earlier raids where it's just the main boss would attack just the primary tank. Here you actually get a lot of AoEs, and a couple of unique mechanics, especially with Gigas, mitigate the time tether, so you don't end up freezing your opponents. The last boss, which is why it's mainly in C tier, kinda drags on for too long. Similar to Hollow Diablos, this boss kinda has a improved defense, to where he doesn't really take a lot of damage. You don't even go to 50% mark until you hit his weak spot, which is the heart of the dragon, I believe. And until you hit that, his health goes from like 80 to 10%, which isn't really engaging because, you know, for most of the attacks you're throwing at him, they're just kind of doing nothing. So if he had a more respectable health pool, or if the fight didn't take as long, this probably would be at mid B tier. But as it stands, it's at high C tier. Coming up strong in B tier, we got Royal City of Raptures, or whatever. Just Royal City. Now, the Royal City compared to C tier is a lot more basic compared to the other ones, but it's a pretty good basic. A lot of the bosses here don't have a fat pool of health. They're pretty unique, and they have some pretty interesting mechanics as well. The first boss with its little white whisper, and the Blizzard 4 mechanics. Scizor being super effective against rock type, and then we have the Executioner from Dark Souls 2. All of them provide some kind of little mechanic or involvement rather than just standing in one place and just slapping a boss. The final boss with the 2 masks is an interesting mechanic, but it gets old really fast, especially when there's 2 mechanics where your direction is misplaced. It goes down a little bit due to that fight, but overall this is a really solid raid that I wouldn't mind getting, especially being at level 70. Pretty good. And rounding out B tier, we also finish off with the level 70 raids with Moonborn Mystery. I kind of give up on that name, you know what I mean. So, at the start with the F-tastic musics, each boss has their own theme and they all have a unique mechanic. The first boss with his little sniper showing the gap in your weakness, the angel taking away a whole alliance so that way they can slay some souls, tainted souls, and holy souls. Thunder God with his very different attacks, but all very telegraphed and pretty unique and actually kind of fun to navigate, as long as the rest of your raid knows what's going on. And then Ultima. Just Ultima. Now what keeps this raid from going from A tier is the final boss. She unfortunately suffers from the boss being too long, as well as having 2 phases, which means that the first phase you're going to destroy it, and then after that the real fight begins. And I'm not gonna lie to you, the first 2 phases, or just the boss in general, isn't that great compared to the ones previously. If I had the opportunity to leave before I fought Ultima, I would. But regardless, besides that terrible final boss, this is a really good raid, and I put it at high B tier. Coming up at A tier with some health warnings, we have the Tower of
Paradigm's Breach. There. Now can I get paid?
This is the final level 80 raid from the Shadowbringers expansion, and this raid is really good. The near raids from Shadowbringers were really good fan service and all had pretty good fights. I would say out of all of them, this one was most likely the weakest. Most of these bosses are just holograms, and although they have some really good mechanics in dodging, I feel like some of them are kind of lackluster in terms of, you know, their mechanics. For example, the 2 shields and lance guys, I can't remember the name, just Hanzo and Genji, and False Idol and her Florenson. She also suffers from Ultima, where there is one a door boss, so a phase 1 and then there's a phase 2, which I actually really enjoyed. A phase 2 is pretty unique, especially when you get slapped with a whole ass building. But the boss prior to that as well, the two little iBots, they are similar to the little Genji and Hanzo, where they're just two bosses and they're not really that great. I think they kind of hold them back and they could have been used for more creative bosses. Besides the two little eyeballs, I know that comes from Nier and, you know, spoilers, the final, you know, few bosses, but I feel like they could have done a bit more with them. But regardless, this is still a really good raid, as well as being high level, so that means you have more abilities and activities for fun. And at high A tier, this one you probably weren't expecting, but we have Syrcus Tower. Now, the reason I put this tower at A tier compared to the other one, which is at the totally different spectrum, this one's low tier and that one's high tier, you might be thinking like, well, since this is level 50, it doesn't have that many mechanics, you're pressing the 3 buttons you complained about with the previous 50 raids. While that is true, this tower is very easy to speedrun compared to the other ones. With all the raids that you could farm with, this would be the easiest. There's only a couple bosses and there's a lot more trash to fight, and most of these battles, they don't require you to use much of your brain power, and you can slaughter them really easily, making this easier to farm. But besides the farming part, these bosses are kind of unique looking. I actually quite like the design of all these bosses except one, which is Almond, because not only do we fight him later on in the game in the Nod rain setting, you know, his boss is kind of like a little gimmicky. I feel like it could have had more oomph to it. But overall, all these bosses are pretty good, and it's a nice callback to FF3 with the final boss. Finally, you can come see my favoritism. At the bottom of S tier, we have the Puppets Bunker. Now, the Puppets Bunker was the first raid that I saw, that I was playing the game and was released into a new patch. So I have a little bit of bias to this, but I really enjoyed this raid when it first came out. And the bosses here are pretty spectacular. The first two units, the first two robot units that we fight, the 813P operated Aegis unit, and the 742P operated Superior Flight unit, Alpha, Beta, G. They don't drag on for too long since they're the second raid in the Shadowbringers lineup, which means that they don't have a giant health pool that you need to burn, so they don't overstay their welcome too much. 905P Heavy Artillery unit is very fun. I like that boss a lot. Accompanied with that music, this boss is accompanied with a banger, making it more fun to fight with. And the mechanics are pretty unique, where you have to look at the computer screens and then you have to figure out the mechanic. And then Compound 2B. Similar to the other ones, this one's a little dragged down due to it having a door boss and then you fight the actual boss, but compared to the other ones, the door boss, the first phase, is very weak and you can burn it relatively easily. So instead of just fighting a normal boss and then you have to get to the second boss, here you just burn like a little trash pack and then you get to the actual final boss. So all these bosses have a pretty good runtime and they all are very unique and it's very active, and I really like all the designs. So Puppets Bunker lands at a solid bottom S. Next up we have Copy Factory. This one is just mainly fan service for Nier Automata fans, as most of these bosses are just trademark things from Nier, like the series jointed command model, the Hobbits, or Hobbies actually, which is just a giant Nier robot just tethered to a Ingus, which is basically like, you know, one of the trademark monsters you fight in Nier, and then Big Boy. So all these bosses are pretty good fan service from Nier Automata, and they all have pretty unique, you know, identities, mechanics, and everything. 9S is usually a dodge fest and a little bit of hiding from his tactics. Ingus, you're trying to just dodge massive attacks that he telegraphed pretty early. Hobbies, you're basically moving around different attack patterns, and you have to adjust to them when he opens the door from the back, which can either be a little claw, some gates, or a little hammer, I think. Okay, with all that said, very brief, but remember, this is all in my eyes and my opinion is obsolete and correct. So Copy Factory lands at S tier. And then finally, at the top of S tier, we have the newest raid actually, Aglaia. This has already became my favorite raid because I really like the theme of this one. The fact that now our player characters that are just fighting just literal gods now, makes this raid experience just feel a whole lot better. The first boss, I can't pronounce any of his names, so I'm just going to use their weapon of choice. The first boss with the giant hammer is he's very expressive. I like his personality. And the boss himself, well, not too complicated, isn't too much of a pushover, you know, he has a lot of insta kills ready for you. The second boss is my favorite because he takes a note from Patrick Star with a giant fist, which he can either use to destruct a meteor or just, you know, end your day. And these bosses have a lot of mix-up as well, so it keeps you pretty engaged. Because they're very new, they do take a bit of time, but once everyone gets accustomed to this raid, I believe that most of these bosses can be burned pretty fast. But they offer something very unique, as they're not really too fantasy focused, they're more like Greek mythology kind of focused, and you can really feel it in this raid, especially with the music that's provided with this. Top tier, easy S tier, and of course if it does change, you know, no, it won't. As stated at the beginning of this video, I will not be ranking any of the gear that comes from these raids or the materials, just mainly my thoughts on the bosses and just the experience of the raids in general. So of course this video is very subjective, so of course if you can very much disagree with a lot of my placements, especially the near raids, but overall this is mainly my thoughts on the 5.14 raids. I thank you for watching, and until next time.